Assalamu alaikum. I'm presenting on Asad's concept of discursive tradition and its impact on Islamic studies today. This presentation offers a very foundational look at Talal Asad's thought. For those who are new to Asad, I hope it serves as an introduction, and for those already familiar, a helpful revisit of the basics. We will start with a very brief overview of Asad's work, then explore his essay, The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam, which reshapes key questions in the discipline of Islamic studies. I will also touch on major debates surrounding discursive tradition before concluding with how Asad incorporates Wittgenstein's philosophy to encourage further reflection on Islam as a discursive tradition. Taral Asad, a distinguished anthropologist, has made significant theoretical contributions across various fields, including anthropology, post-colonial studies, religious studies, Middle Eastern studies, Islamic studies, and political theology. He currently holds the title of Emeritus Professor of Anthropology and Middle Eastern Studies at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Asad's intellectual heritage is noteworthy. He was born in 1932 in Medina to Mohammad Asad, an Austrian-born Jewish convert to Islam, who later became a prominent Muslim intellectual, diplomat, and writer. His mother, Munira Hussein al-Shamari, was from the Shamar tribe in Saudi Arabia. The family moved to British India shortly after Asad's birth, following an invitation to Muhammad Asad from prominent Muslims in India while he was in Mecca. Taral Asad later moved to London in 1950 at the age of 18, initially studying architecture. After completing his architecture studies in 2 years, he turned to anthropology, earning his MA from the University of Edinburgh and his PhD from Oxford in 1968 under the guidance of the noted anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard. Asad's first book, The Kababish Arabs, Power, Authority and Consent, published in 1970, is based on his PhD dissertation and explores the complexities of power structures within the nomadic Kababish tribes of northern Sudan. In 1961, he began his teaching career at the University of Khartoum, founded by Oxford, where he remained for 5 years. He later spent 2 decades as a lecturer at the University of Hull before moving to the United States in 1988. During this period, Asad published his edited book, Anthropology and the Colonial Encounter, a landmark text that examined how colonialism shaped anthropology as a discipline. Asad's work exposed the extent to which colonial power influenced both the production of anthropological knowledge and its subject of study culture. In this text, Asad argued that it is wrong to view anthropology during the colonial period merely as a tool of colonial rule or as a reflection of colonial ideology. Rather, he contended that anthropology was shaped by the unequal power relationships between Western colonizers and the cultures they controlled. This marked the beginning of his larger intellectual project, understanding how power, knowledge, and colonialism are intertwined. In the 1980s, Asad's critical interventions continued as he engaged with debates in American academia. In Writing Culture, edited by James Clifford and George Marcus, Asad's critique of cultural translation in British anthropology stood out. By analyzing an essay by Ernest Gellner, Asad demonstrated how power relations influence anthropological practices, questioning the tendency of anthropologists to impose acceptable meanings on seemingly absurd cultural beliefs. His critique cautioned against the anthropologist's excessive charity in contextual interpretation, which often oversimplified complex cultural dynamics. Asad's investigation from the 1980s into the religion as an anthropological construct built upon his earlier studies. A central aspect of this work was his critique of Clifford Geertz' theorization of religion as a cultural system. This critique not only questioned the universalist definition of religion, but also addressed the growing tendency following the linguistic turn in anthropology to textualize culture primarily as the anthropologist's must read text. For Asad, understanding cultural and religious symbols necessitates consideration of the practical context and social rules in which they are employed. In contrast, Geertz defined religion as a universal human experience constituted through symbolic systems that exist separately from the real world. In his book, Genealogies of Religion, Asad explores how this perspective has been profoundly influenced by developments within modern Christian theology. He argues that the transition to an abstract and universal concept of religion in Christian theology reflects broader changes in the modern landscape of power and knowledge, particularly with the rise of modern science, production, and the state. By tracing this genealogy of the construction of religion as an anthropological category, Asad more importantly examines how the concept has been used in anthropology to classify and often control non Western societies. Okay. So, this is a slide on genealogies of religion. Asad's critique of secularism is an extension of his studies on religion. In Formations of the Secular, Christianity, Islam, and Modernity, he argues that secularism is not simply a continuation or break from religion, but rather a complex political and epistemological project that underpins modernity. For Asad, secularism is a form of governance that shapes how religion is controlled and understood in the modern Western world. He interrogates the assumption that secularism is a neutral or universal framework, highlighting how secular practices create a certain type of religious subject, one distanced from the real world and focused on individual belief. Assad traces how the modern notion of religion as a universal human experience emerged from a specific Western historical context and was imposed on non-Western societies, ignoring their distinct religious and cultural history. Employing Wittgenstein's notion of grammar of ideas or grammar of concepts, which elucidates the intricate interplay between the practice and concepts, Assad aims to discern how shifts in social practices and power relations reshape the conceptual frameworks of both secularism and religion. Instead of tracing the evolution of these conceptual frameworks in the West through a linear historical lens, Assad adopts a genealogical approach influenced by the methodologies of Michel Foucault and Nietzsche. By challenging the presumption that secularism operates as a neutral or universal framework, Assad's intervention signifies a pivotal moment in the debates surrounding secularism that emerged in the early 2000s, particularly in response to global conflicts and the resurgence of religious politics. In the idea of anthropology of Islam, the essay, Talal Asad critically redefines the study of Islam by challenging the conventional perception of it as a static social blueprint or an integrated totality where social structures and religious ideologies merely interact. He introduces the concept of discursive tradition, which shifts the focus of analysis from observable behaviors to the intricate relationship between practices and the underlying discourses that shape them. Assad emphasizes the significant role of power in defining orthodoxy and regulating Islamic practices, arguing that authority profoundly influences religious interpretations. Moreover, he acknowledges the inherent diversity of Islamic practices across various historical and geographical contexts, effectively resisting reductionist views that fail to capture this complexity. The concept of discursive tradition has become a pivotal framework influencing not only anthropology but also religious studies, post-colonial studies, and Islamic studies, prompting scholars to explore the deeper discursive contexts that inform and shape religious practices. I think we'll look more closer to the essay. In the idea of an anthropology of Islam, Talal raises the pivotal question: what exactly is the anthropology of Islam and what is its object of investigation? He systematically examines three common responses to this question. Some scholars, such as Abdul Hamid Al Zain, argues that Islam dissolves as an analytical category due to its myriad forms. Assad counters this perspective by asserting that if Islam is not considered as an analytic category, then an anthropology of Islam cannot exist. He emphasizes the necessity of retaining Islam as a distinct category of inquiry. Michel Gilsman presents Islam as a merely a label of the diverse practices that Muslims claim as Islamic. In response, Assad critiques this approach, arguing that defining Islam solely based on what adherents claim is problematic. He points out that interpretations often conflict and are influenced by social relations, necessitating that anthropologists examine community dynamics rather than relying on static definitions. So the third response, Islam as a distinct historical totality. Ernest Gellner's Muslim Society exemplifies the view that Islam serves as a distinct historical totality that organizes various aspects of social life. Gellner's model illustrates how social structure, religious belief, and political behavior interact with an Islamic framework. Assad engages with Gellner's assumptions and concepts, highlighting the theoretical challenges associated with writing an anthropology of Islam, particularly as these ideas are prevalent in other scholarly works. In the subsequent sections of the essay, Assad delves deeper into these theoretical challenges, critiquing the assumptions that underpin prevalent scholarly narratives and illuminating the complexities involved in framing an anthropology of Islam. In his critical examination of Ernest Gellner's Muslim Society, Assad engages with Gellner's comparative analysis of Islam and Christianity, highlighting their differing historical configurations of power and belief. Gellner characterizes Christianity as exhibiting political modesty while positioning Islam as possessing theocratical potential, thereby situating Christianity in Europe and Islam in Middle East. However, Assad challenges this assertion, contending that Christian practices have historically intertwined with political power just as significantly as Islamic practices. He critiques Gellner's framing of Europe as the true locus of Christianity and the Middle East as the true locus of Islam, arguing that such a binary oversimplifies the complexities inherent in both religions and their respective histories. Assad emphasizes that the focus should not merely be on the historical essence of religion, but rather on the implications of these contracts for conceptualizing itself. He advocates for anthropologists to investigate the distinct strategies employed by medieval Christian and Muslim authorities in regulating populations rather than relying on superficial distinctions between the two faiths. Through his anthropological analysis of practices such as monastic rituals, the sacrament of confession, and the medieval Inquisition in 12th century Western Europe, Assad illustrates the nuanced relationship between power and religion, thereby revealing the inadequacies in Gellner's characterization of Islam as a mirror image of Christianity. He underscores the necessity for more accurate conceptual framework to capture the complexities of the interplay between religion and power in both traditions. Talal Asad then moves on to examine Asad means Gellner's conceptualization of Islam as a determinate social blueprint, highlighting Gellner's portrayal of classic Muslim society through dramatic roles that simplify complex social dynamics. Gellner depicts a landscape marked by tensions such as a segmentary tribe versus centralized tribes, nomads yearning for urban life, merchants wary of nomadic influences, and saints acting as mediators. Yet, this representation emphasizes social structures through conflict while neglecting the indigenous discourses that inform these interactions. In Gellner's analysis, Islamic actors are depicted as mere agents of behavior, devoid of the capacity for thought or speech, resulting in a narrative that lacks insights into the discourses guiding their actions. By treating language as merely an instrument for facilitating power process, Gellner implies that the dynamics of domination would remain unchanged even in the absence of Islamic linguistic frames. This instrumentalist view falls short of capturing the culturally motivated nature of actors and the ways in which discourse shapes events and responses to authority. While both Gellner and Clifford Geertz frame Islam as a theater of religiosity and power, they overlook the intricate indigenous discourses that imbue Islamic practices and behaviors with meaning. Assad asserts that the actions of Islamic actors are influenced by specific historical conditions and political economies, challenging the notion that they are solely driven by intrinsic tribal or religious motives. Talal Asad critiques Gellner's portrayal of Middle Eastern societies as static and dualistic, emphasizing the historical dynamism of these societies shaped by external relations rather than a self contained Islamic social structure. Asa argues that the discussion of these societies should prioritize connections, changes, and differences, recognizing that the integrity of the Islamic world is more an ideological and discursive construct than a fixed historical reality. He challenges Gellner's binary framework, which juxtaposes tribesmen linked to traditional religions centered on saints and shrines against urban dwellers who embody a religion grounded in the Holy Book. By advocating for a contextualized understanding of religion within its social structures, Assad calls for rejecting this static dualism in favor of a nuanced exploration of overlapping social contexts. He posits that viewing the Middle East as a site of convergences allows for a richer tapestry of histories, making simplistic typologies less convincing. Furthermore, Assad notes that Gellner's work employs varied religious concepts, tribal religion reflecting Durkheim's collective rituals, urban poor religion aligning with Marx's idea of false consciousness, and bourgeoisie Islam drawing from Weber's Protestant ethic, demonstrating how differing definitions of religion shape anthropological inquiry. He asserts that the way religion is conceptualized significantly influences the types of questions posed, and without addressing these complexities, anthropologists risk reinforcing false oppositions that obscure the intricate motives and meanings within contemporary Islamic context. This critique ultimately calls for a more nuanced approach of understanding religion that transcends simplistic dichotomies, enriching the discourse on contemporary Islam. Tala's reconstruction of religion as an anthropological category is pivotal in understanding his critique of Gellner, particularly regarding Clifford Geertz' two-stage method of analysis. By challenging universal definitions of religion, which are often rooted in a Western Christian context, Assad underscores the limitations of a framework that separates religion from power dynamics. He contends that Geertz' approach, which first analyzes symbols before considering social structures, oversimplifies the intricate relationship between symbols and social practices. This method risks neglecting the ways in which religious symbols are embedded within and shaped by broader social, political, and economic contexts. Assad argues for a more integrated approach that acknowledges the authoritative discourses that inform religious practices, emphasizing that religion cannot be fully understood without considering the specific historical and cultural forces at play. In this context, Assad's concept of Islam as a discursive tradition is vital for understanding the complexities of Islamic practices. Rather than viewing Islam merely as a set of beliefs or social structures, Assad emphasizes that it is fundamentally a tradition rooted in discourses that guide practitioners in their understanding and performance of religious practices. These discourses connect the historical foundations of Islam as articulated in the Quran and Hadith with contemporary interpretations and applications, thus shaping how Muslims engage with their faith. Assad posits that the essence of this tradition lies in its dynamic character, which is constantly negotiated and reinterpreted by its adherents in response to evolving social and political contexts. This perspective invites anthropologists to explore how power dynamics influence the establishment and modification of practices, as well as how conflicts and arguments surrounding these practices are integral to the tradition itself. By framing Islam as a discursive tradition, Assad encourages a nuanced inquiry into the ways in which authority, community, and individual interpretation intersect, offering a richer understanding of the lived experiences of Muslims across diverse settings and historical moments. Islamic studies is characterized by major points of discussion that reflects its complexity and the ongoing evolution of the field. First, the Orientalist legacy continues to influence the discipline, where the power imbalances created by studying Islam from a colonial perspective have prompted critical examination by scholars like Edward Said. This leads to the epistemological challenge of reconciling traditional Islamic scholarship with modern secular methodologies, where scholars must navigate the dichotomy between viewing religious texts as expressions of faith and as academic objects of inquiry. The political dimensions of Islam have gained increasing attention, particularly following the significant events such as the Iranian Revolution and 9/11, which have shifted the focus towards understanding Muslims primarily through security-related frameworks. Finally, there is a growing emphasis on lived Islam, which prioritizes the everyday practices and experiences of Muslims, moving the center of gravity in Islamic studies from doctrinal texts to the embodied realities of individuals within their cultural context. In this complex landscape, Assad's interventions is central in reorienting the discourses within Islamic studies. Assad not only critiques the lingering influence of Orientalist method in Islamic studies, but also examines how the power dynamics underlying Orientalism shape the very conceptualizing of Islam. Assad's discursive tradition challenges the tension between traditional Islamic scholarships and modern secular method. He shows that Islamic scholars constantly engage with external context to ensure proper practice, while secular scholars must consider internal Islamic discourses. This approach blurs the rigid boundary between insider and outsider perspectives, in Islamic studies. Assad critiques the simplistic Western notion that Islam uniquely merges religion and politics, a view that overlooks the complexities of Christian history. He argues that the separation of religion and politics is a modern Western construct shaped by post Reformation Europe. Through his genealogical analysis of medieval Christianity, such as monastic rituals and Inquisition, Assad challenges the foundation of the Western critique and reveals the historical and epistemological context from which these assumptions about Islam and politics arise. And the fourth point, Assad challenges the Orientalist distinction between Orthodox and heterodox Islam, arguing that any Muslim discourse engaging with Islamic past and present practices is part of the Islamic tradition. He emphasized that diversity in Muslim practices reflects different forms of reasoning shaped by specific social and historical contexts. Orthodoxy for Assad is a relationship of power to truth, shaped by how Muslims regulate or conduct practices, making debates over correct practice central to Islamic tradition. Okay, so Assad's concept of Islam as a discursive tradition has sparked significant debate among scholars, highlighting various interpretations and critique. One major critique comes from critics like Wilson, who argues that Assad downplays the role of theology in shaping orthodoxy, focusing primarily on its sociological production. Shahab Ahmad further critiques Assad's framework as solely overly prescriptive, suggesting it creates a rigid binary between orthodoxy and heterodoxy. He argues that this framing fails to account for non prescriptive or exploratory Islamic practices, thus constraining the understanding of tradition within a narrow authoritarian context. Bankstead adds another layer to this critique, asserting that Assad's emphasis on foundational texts like the Quran and Hadith neglects the diverse local context and personal interests that shape Islamic discourses, leading to varied interpretations of Islam. While Assad critiques the general conception of religion, some scholars caution that his use of tradition risks becoming an overly broad explanatory tool. Additionally, critics highlight the need for a balance between Assad's focus on ethics and effect with a more existential understanding of everyday Muslim life, arguing that the discursive power operates in a situational and fragmented manner. This perspective calls for a more grounded understanding of how Muslims navigate their lives amidst theoretical debates of what constitutes Islam. A fundamental critique arises from the tension between Assad's focus on continuity through tradition and the genealogical method's emphasis on historical ruptures and discontinuities. Critics suggest that Assad's approach may downplay significant breaks introduced by colonial modernity, potentially obscuring the complexities and diversities within Islamic practices. In his recent article, Talal Asad further elaborates on his concept of Islam as a discursive tradition by drawing on the philosophical insights of Wittgenstein. Assad emphasizes the intricate relationship between language, practice, and lived practice, suggesting that a discursive tradition encompasses the complex temporal movements through which individuals strive to master language in their daily lives. Assad here argues that while the embodiment is necessary, it is insufficient on its own. The core of the human experience resides in the capacity to learn and use language effectively. Mastery of a form of life cultivated through sustained practice can render explicit science unnecessary, suggesting that religious practices are primarily ways of being rather than merely theoretical constructs. In this framework, Assad interprets Wittgenstein's notion of form of life not as a representation of an entire culture, but as any distinctive mode of human expression, how individuals speak, think, behave, and interact. This understanding of behavior as a form of life reveals how language articulates, characterizes, and shapes human distinctiveness. Assad emphasizes that the multiple use of language necessitate an investigation of the intricate relationships between discourse and life, particularly through the concept of grammar. He posits that the distinction between familiar and unfamiliar words is critical. Some expressions require no interpretation because their grammar has been mastered within a specific form of life. Here, there are no absolute principles for determining meanings. It is a grammar that elucidates how words function in particular contexts. The focus is not merely on how meaning is ascribed, but on how something becomes intelligible and usable in given situations. Assad's conceptualization of discursive tradition is not about defining identity in opposition to other traditions or yearning for the past. Rather, it signifies an instant present that disciplines its members through a shared heritage, language, activities, and ways of being. This articulation of tradition also embodies an engagement with uncertainty and disagreement about what is included or excluded within it. Mastering the specific grammar of tradition cultivates individuals who embody particular virtues. Thus, faith is not simply an external behavior or a state of mind, but a synthesis of both. Learning and practicing the Islamic tradition, including the ways of thinking, feeling, talking, and acting, are essential for deepening and sustaining Iman. In Asad's view, a discursive tradition presupposes mastery of the grammars that shape ordinary life. As practices initiated through discourse develop into faithful form of life, they become instinctive, requiring no further interpretation. Instead, this process necessitates time as individuals learn to recognize and engage with the complexities of the world through the demands of everyday language. While I'm leaving Asad's thought on discursive tradition here, I recognize how this concept has been applied various ways in our previous sessions, especially last day's evening session on lived Islam. However, I'm not aiming to use Asad's reading of discursive tradition as an everyday practice to address those critiques here. Instead, I leave this open for further reflection and exploration on Islam as a discursive tradition. Thank you.